Rev up those chainsaw guns and prepare to sink them deep into the immaculately molded face of a locust or two, because we're breaking down all the different settings worth tweaking in Gears Tactics. Yes, we are benchmarking a tactics game. Surprising, I admit, but the thinking man's Gears Tactics is full of just as many visual bells and whistles as his big dumb shooty Gears cousins. Look at these beautiful beards. Look at all the reflections off those chunky shoulder pads. And then zoom way out where you don't really see any of it. Perfect. The good news is that the action in Gears Tactics is surprisingly fluid, with none of the weird hitching and stuttering between turns that plagued XCOM 2. And the better news is that it performs well on practically any modern hardware, especially if you dial back a few settings. But which settings to tweak first? Even if you're a seasoned Gears fan, I think you'll find that the settings you can get away with adjusting in a top-down strategy game are quite a bit different than a third-person shooter. Being a bit further removed from the action does have its advantages. Case in point, the World Detail setting is one of the first sliders you should adjust if you're having performance issues in Gears Tactics. That's World Detail and not the extremely similar World Texture Detail. We want the one that governs level of detail, or in other words, the further an object is from the camera, the less effort Gears Tactics spends on rendering it. Lowering this setting in a boots-on-the-ground shooter usually results in distracting pop-in, with burning wreckage and rusted bunkers suddenly snapping into focus as you approach, or even appearing out of thin air. Turning this all the way down to low in a traditional Gears game would be a last-ditch effort to hit 60 frames per second. In a tactics game though, there's less debris on the streets, and you might still notice occasional pop-in when Gears Tactics cuts to a ground-level action shot, but that doesn't happen often, and I generally found the visual differences unnoticeable. The performance improvement is big though. Dipping World Detail down to low boosted my frame rate a staggering 28%, and like I said, it's something you'll barely notice when you're hovering high overhead. Check out this scene for instance. Sure, less debris on the street, like I said. Less grass there in the center. And the papers on the left disappear as we move from ultra down to low, but it's nothing that impacts the game itself, and you don't really miss it when it's gone. The scene is richer with it, but doesn't feel lacking without. Dynamic shadows is another setting I'd rarely touch in a traditional shooter. Hell, when Jared Walton benchmarked Gears 5 for us last October, he noted that while dynamic shadow quality had the single biggest impact on performance, that you should still try to keep it at high or medium if possible. Otherwise, the scene looked flat. But we're not playing a traditional Gears game, are we? Disabling dynamic shadows in Gears Tactics results in the same flat look, but it doesn't matter nearly as much when you're fighting locusts from the perspective of a commander, and turning this setting fully off nets a whopping 31% bump in frame rate. If you can't stand the floaty looking locusts in Gears, setting dynamic shadows one step up to medium still results in a 21% frame rate boost, and with no appreciable difference in fidelity between that and ultra. When we're talking 20 and 30% boosts, disabling planar reflections seems downright modest in comparison. Still, it's another setting you're unlikely to miss because it governs whether Gears Tactics displays reflections of objects that aren't even on screen, like a looming church steeple or the smoldering remains of an APC. You probably won't miss them, so disabling planar reflections is essentially a free 8% boost to frame rate. There's one last setting worth discussing because it's a bit tricky. Gears Tactics has a setting for minimum frame rate, which sounds innocuous enough. Open it up, you'll find you can set it to off, 30, 60, and 90, with 60 as the default. You should be aware, though, that this is a clever name for resolution scaling. If your frame rate dips below whatever you set as the floor, Gears Tactics dynamically adjusts the render resolution to compensate, and then upscales the resulting image to your monitor resolution. You might as well leave it on. I actually find the upscaling fairly unobtrusive here, and it can allow you to run the game one or even two presets higher than usual without much trouble. At native 1080p Ultra by default, for instance, with Gears Tactics quietly dipping the resolution lower when there's a swarm of wretches and drones approaching, or a massive explosion that's over in only a few seconds. But if you're wondering why the screen sometimes looks blurrier, it's not your eyes, and you do not need stronger glasses. It's this damned minimum frame rate setting, and I bring it up because it's a bit more hidden than the usual resolution scaling slider. As you might guess, I don't recommend running Gears Tactics at 4K Ultra on a GTX 1650. That said, it is a strategy game. The requirements aren't all that steep. A GTX 1650 more than cleared the medium preset at 1080p and even held its own on high with only the occasional dip below 60 frames per second. You could probably use the minimum frame rate setting to your advantage here, playing on high on a GTX 1650 and allowing the game to dynamically scale the resolution when it starts to chug. The same can be said of the GTX 1660 Ti and RX 5600 XT on Ultra. Both barely clear the 60 frames per second market at 1080p Ultra, which goes to show just how gorgeous Gears Tactics can be. The minimum frame rate setting can help tip the scales though. It shouldn't have to kick in all that often and thus won't be too distracting. You should also keep in mind that the presets in Gears Tactics are a chainsaw and not a scalpel. That's why we zero in on which settings you should tweak for the greatest benefit. If you absolutely can't stand dynamic resolution scaling, fine, but don't drop an entire preset just to gain 4 to 5 frames. Lower world detail or dynamic shadows and leave the rest as is, and you might find all your performance troubles disappear like a locust being hit by the hammer of dawn. And while the vast majority of people still play games at 1080p, I went ahead and tested Gears Tactics at 4K. It's surprisingly tough to hit 60 frames per second at 4K. Yes, even in a quiet little tactics game. Not even the 2080 Ti could maintain a steady 60 on Ultra, though dropping to high put us well over the edge. Consider an RTX 2070 Super the baseline for solid 4K performance, and an RTX 2080 Super ideal. Good luck out there! I'm having a great time with Gears Tactics so far, though I have to say, no manual saves in a tactics game? Blasphemy. How dare you stop me from save scumming every 30 seconds? Thanks as always to MSI for providing the hardware we use for testing, and we'll be back soon with more benchmarks.